All right, so it is good to be back. Been a strange week last week, right? We had to cancel, we had some COVID issues, the main church didn't have childcare, so, most of our group, half of them depend on that. So, we just decided just cancel and do it for next Wednesday, but then it's good to be back again, doing this again, so.
Louder.
Last time we were together, we talked about Jehovah Nissi, the Lord our banner, and as a recap to that, I compared it to like a flag bearer in war. So that's like a man who goes into battle with with his regiment without a weapon, but instead he's completely unarmed and all he's doing is carrying a flag into battle. Now, as long as he was holding that flag on a battlefield, everybody knew to continue to fight, to continue to rally around him. Soldiers would rally around, they protect the flag, they protect the banner. There's a great metaphor for how we need to fight our battles as well. We need to let God go ahead of us. We need to let God protect us. God fight for us. And we just need to carry God into battle so he can carry us through the battle. We talked about the name Jehovah Nissi when it first appeared, and that's when Moses was holding his arms up in Israel's first battle in Exodus. And afterwards, he made that altar to remind who was fighting for him. And we talked about God telling Moses to pass this on to the next generations as well. So Joshua was paying attention, and he learned to lean on the Lord in battle. So when he went into the promised land, he was able to conquer 31 kings to take that promised land. And the story of Joshua is filled with a lot of glorious triumphs, but it was also filled with a giant downfall as well, which was they didn't pass it on to the next generation. Joshua was paying attention, but the next generation didn't pay attention after him because they didn't pass it on. That's when we go into the next book, which is the book of Judges. And the summary on that is that everyone just did what was right in their own eyes. Now, during that time period of Judges, we talked about Israel was on this vicious cycle, basically. They would fall away into sin and idolatry, and sin would have consequences, so they would have retribution for it. And God would take other nations and invade their land, conquer the people. And they would get desperate, they would turn back to God with genuine hearts, they would plead for his help, and God, with his mercy and grace, he would hear their cries, and he would send help. He'd raise up a champion, which was known as a judge at that time, to turn back the people to him and deliver Israel back from the oppressors. But it was really sad, because after that judge was gone, the people would just fall back to their old ways. And that cycle would just continue to repeat. And in fact, that was 12 times in the book of Judges that cycle repeated. So last week, we talked a little bit about Gideon, and Gideon was the 5th judge, and he had a battle when he went against the Midianites. His army of 82,000 men actually got reduced to 300 people to go up against a force of 135,000 strong. That's because God wanted to show to lean on him and do it in God's strength, not in his own. So God can have the victory with it. So, in the end, Gideon and his army, they didn't even have to pick up a single weapon to conquer. The enemy's camp was so full of fear that all they had to do was just show up to overtake him. God went before him. He was already fighting that battle before them. And all they had to do was just hold fast to their faith and just walk in it. And to me, that's what it means to have the Lord as your banner. To know that he's in control, to know that he's going to protect you, to know that he's going to have the victory and the glory. And we just need to be able to face that enemy and enter into battle and hold our faith up high. So yeah, that was last week. Last week we talked a lot about battle, a lot about war. This week, we're going to go to the opposite end of the spectrum. We're going to talk about peace. We're going to focus on a different name of God this week, which is Jehovah Shalom. The Lord is our peace. And ironically enough, this is actually found in the same scriptures that we covered last week. We find his name first appears in the book of Judges, chapter 6, which is where we find that story of Gideon again. So, like I said, we know that Gideon's story started with this vicious cycle where Israel was being continually raided, and in Gideon's case is by a group called the Midianites. This group is killing Israel's livestock, they're running their crops, Israel's sheltering in caves and clefts and strongholds because they're just getting destroyed out there. Their livelihood's decimated, and they're just struggling to put food on the table at this point. And the people are crying out for God, and God hears their pleas, and he sends his angel to Gideon. This is in Judges 6, 11 through 13. You want to read?
The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abizarite,
Yeah.
where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a wine press to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied. "But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian."
I talked about this a little bit last week, and I'll say it again because I love how real the Bible is at this point, because the angel comes to Gideon and says, "The Lord's with you." And Gideon says, "Pardon me, but where's God? We're getting destroyed. We're getting decimated. Where is God? Where is all the wonders that people talk about? Look around, angel. We're overrun by the enemy. God's not here with us. We're abandoned, forsaken." And sometimes we feel that way. But that's when God called Gideon and says, "You're the one that I'm going to call to fix this problem." But this week I want to kind of look at the scripture and look at it in a little bit of a different aspect, because I want you to notice something else. I want you to notice, go back one bit to verse 11. I want you to notice where Gideon was when the angel was saying this stuff. Verse 11 tells us that Gideon is in a wine press and he's threshing wheat to keep it from the Midianites. Now, I'm confident that none of us have ever threshed wheat in our life, right? So the significance of this probably gets lost on us, which is fine. But when we understand it, it paints a much deeper picture of this scripture. So when you thresh wheat, what you're doing is separating the edible parts of the grain from the stalks. So back in the biblical days, what they would do, they would actually pile up the wheat of what's known as a threshing floor. The threshing floor was usually a large, flat stone on the edge of town, out in the open. And what they would do is they would pile the wheat onto it, and they would let their cattle or their ox stamp across it, because they would break up the chaff, they would break up the stalks, they would break up the wheat, and separate it all. And then they would take a pitchfork or a winnowing fork, and they would kind of scoop up this trampled mess, and all the heavy grain would just fall right there in a pile. And as they shake it, the wind would blow the chaff, these like little wisps basically from the stalk. It would blow that away, and then you'd be left with the inedible stalk, which you would just throw in a pile to burn. So now in a wine press, it's kind of the opposite of it. It's not in a large open space. It was actually usually kind of like in a carved stone area. In Gideon's case, it was probably near those caves and the cliffs that they were hiding in. So for a wine press, you would actually dig into the rock. You would have a basin, you would have a pit, basically, so the grapes can go in and crush. And then you would actually have another level and some steps down in a lower area in the pit for the juice to fall down into collecting. So when you have that lower level, it's underground, basically. It's not a good place for Gideon to be threshing this stuff, because it's a tight space, you don't have the wind, and it's basically counterproductive for him to be threshing grain. So why would he be doing it there? Because it's a good place to hide. See, Gideon's ruled by fear. He's afraid of the Midianites. He's afraid that they're going to take his food. And in my opinion, he's afraid of his life as well. If he goes out to the threshing floor where he's supposed to do all this, he's going to be out in the open and on the edge of town, and he's going to be vulnerable. If the Midianites attack, they'd be able to see him a mile away. And in that wine press, in that pit, he can hide out. He can keep out of their line of sight. It's probably isolated enough that if something starts happening, he can sneak off. He has a much better chance to escape. So this is the spot where the angel comes to him. And notice in verse 12, the words to him is, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Why is he calling this man that's hiding in the pit a mighty warrior? Because God knows the plan. He knows Gideon's potential. He knows that Gideon is going to be a mighty warrior, even though Gideon doesn't know it yet. So Judges 6:14 through 16. Anyone?
The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Gideon's hand. Am I not sending you? Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied. "But how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." The Lord answered, "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive."
So last week I kind of summed this up saying that Gideon's telling God, you got the wrong guy here, man. You know, you're picking not only the wrong litter, but the wrong runt. I'm a runt. There's so many stronger tribes that God can pick. There's so many stronger families than Gideon. And actually, Gideon's the least in his family. He's the weakling. And that's probably why he's hiding out in this wine press in the first place. But God's telling him that it's not going to be by Gideon's power and strength, but by God's power and strength. God's telling him, I'm going to be with you. And we talked about how God was with them and how God really carried them through that battle and that victorious outcome in the situation. But here's the thing we didn't cover last week. There's a conversation right after this with the Lord in the wine press. Gideon didn't just go, yeah, you're calling me out, let's go. Let's dive in. Let's jump in with both feet. Instead, Gideon's a little scared. He's a little timid to take that first step. He wants to be sure, so he's asking God for a sign. So Judges 6:17 through 18. All right.
Gideon replied, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it's really you talking to me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you." And the Lord said, "I will wait until you return."
So to me, this is a testimony of how patient and how kind and loving God really is, right? Because he just sent Gideon an angel. He gave him clearly his call and says, this is it. And gave him even this awesome encouragement and this inspiration that you think Gideon would just go. But instead he says, hey, let's just make sure here. How about you just sit right there? I'll go get a snack and we can kind of talk about this. Let me make this offering to you, God, and we'll take some time. And God, you can really be sure that you have this right guy here for the job. See, Gideon's still fearful, right? But now it's a different kind of fear. It's a different kind of fear that he's not enough, that maybe he's not the right man for the job. And we can kind of maybe laugh at Gideon a little bit here, but we do the same thing, right? God says, go. We say, who, me? You know, are you sure? You know, we feel like we're going to fall short sometimes, many times. You know, maybe God tells us to go talk to somebody, but we're fearful that we're not going to have the right words. Maybe God tells us to teach others about him or talk about him, but we're afraid because we might not have the answers. Maybe we have to respond with, I don't know. You know, we get stuck in that fear mentality and it keeps our feet rooted where we're at. And, you know, instead of walking where we need to be. So Gideon's trying to work through this fear and anxiety that he's facing. So he's asking for a moment so he could do his offering. And he says, God, if you really want me to do this, just make it very clear to me. Give me a sign. Judges 6:19 to 22. He gets a sign. It says, Gideon went inside, prepared a young goat, and from the ephah of flour he made bread without yeast, putting the meat in the basket and broth in the pot. He brought them out and offered to him under the oak. The angel of God said to him, take the meat and the unleavened bread, place them on this rock, and pour out the broth. And Gideon did so. Then the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread with the tip of his staff that was in his hand. Fire flared up from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread, and the angel of the Lord disappeared. When Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, Alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. So Gideon asked for a sign, make sure it's correct, and Gideon got his sign. He went, he prepared that offering, he placed it on a rock. The angel touched it with its staff, it consumed it, and the angel vanished. And now Gideon has a different kind of fear coming over top of him. It's a realization, this is real. This is legit, right? This was indeed God speaking to him and telling him what to do. This was indeed an angel that came to him. This was that he was going to go up against the Midianites and save Israel. You know, it's one thing to talk about things, but when you're actually in the moment and you realize it's going to happen, a different kind of nerves takes you, right? You know, if everybody had to do public speaking, or even an interview, or when you're getting ready to perform, or anything that's in front of people, you know, you could rehearse, you could practice beforehand, and you can know when it's going to happen, but actually when it's time to go up there, when it's time to go on that stage, it just kind of clicks in your mind that this is real, this is going to happen. And you get that different kind of fear and anxiety starting to go on, right? You get those butterflies in your stomachs, your hands and palms get sweaty. And in my view, this is what Gideon was going through, because this was getting very real for him. And he was fearful of many nights. He was fearful that maybe he wasn't the right guy, and he's fearful that he's going to need to step out of that wine press. And he needs to, because God is calling him out. But this loving God knows Gideon's fear, and he knows his anxiety, and he knows the situation, because he speaks these words over Gideon. Judges 6:23. But the Lord said to him, "Peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die." God told Gideon, peace, don't be afraid. And you can see this pattern over and over in the Bible. When God's going to do something big in people's lives, he says, do not be afraid or fear not, some kind of variation of these words. Because God recognizes that we're scared to take those steps sometimes, right? He knows us. He knit us in that womb. But he's telling us to trust him. You know, we get to face that situation because we have that, you know, we get afraid to face that situation because we have that overwhelming dread of what if's going to happen. You know, I think about my grandkids in the swimming pool, right? They're standing on the edge, and you have the 7-year-old at the deep end, or even the 4-year-old at the shallow end, and their feet don't touch the bottom, so they're scared to go in there, you know? They have that inherent fear of drowning, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But if all they did was just play on the edge of the pool, they'd miss out. But if I'm in there, or Crystal's in there, or their father, or their mom saying, don't worry, I got you, jump in my arms. It takes that trust. It takes that leap. And they jump into his arms, and then they get a completely different aspect. They get a completely different world open to them. And that's how I picture God sometimes, just telling us, watching us on that edge, just telling us, take a step, jump into my arms. I got a whole different world for you here. So God's telling Gideon to take that step. Trust in me. You're not going to die. Don't trust in the situation, but trust in me. Have peace and do not be afraid. Those words from the Lord comforted Gideon. Those words from the Lord calmed his fears and his anxiety, so much that Gideon decided to make an altar as a permanent reminder of that moment. Judges 6:24. Anyone?
So Gideon built an altar to the Lord there and called it "The Lord is Peace." To this day, it stands in Ophrah. Oh, there's that word again.
Abizarites.
Oh, that's what you said.
Abizarites. Those people.
There, it stands there.
But this is where we see the name of the Lord here. Jehovah Shalom, the Lord is peace. Gideon built an altar that day and called it Jehovah Shalom, the Lord is peace. It was a milestone, right? It was that God gave him peace that day, literally pulled him up from that pit and was able to break that cycle of fear and anxiety that was ruling Gideon's life, right? Instead of fear, shalom, peace. But that word shalom, it actually goes deeper than just the surface level of peace. Shalom is a Hebrew word that translates to not only peace, but it also means harmony. It means wholeness. It means completeness. It means prosperity, welfare, tranquility. It's a feeling that all is well within my soul. It's that feeling that Gideon had that day over the situation. Now, notice the words that I used there, that Gideon had it over that situation, because we usually have a very distorted view of what peace means, right? A lot of times we think about peace being this external thing, right? That peace means everybody stops having war around me, that everything raging against us has to calm down, that everything coming against us just has to stop. We think peace means quiet. We think it means the absence of conflict. But if you look at the situation with Gideon, there's still a massive amount of conflict still happening, right? The Midianites just didn't go away. You know, there's still a war on the horizon. In fact, the next several verses of Judges 6 shows us the conflict that Gideon goes into. He's going to still have to fight that battle at the camp. The war didn't stop just because Gideon had peace with the situation and built that altar. So anybody looking outside of the situation would definitely tell you that clearly this is not a time for peace. But Gideon still built that altar, right? He still declared peace. He still declared Jehovah Shalom. Why? Because there's a secret. Peace doesn't determine what's happening out there. Peace is determined by what's happening here. Think about it. Gideon now had a purpose. He now had a wholeness. He now had a completeness. He had a tranquility. He confronted his feelings about that situation. He didn't let that situation define him any longer. He came to peace that God is bigger than that situation that's going out there. He wasn't fearful of the external factors because he gave them over to God. That wasn't the same Gideon that's hiding in the wine press anymore after that day. I'd like to tell you that it was perfect after that, right? And Gideon declared peace and built that altar. Nothing bothered him again for the rest of the future time, right? But that's the problem, right? We declare peace over things, over the situations. But when we do that, the enemy's going to come and try to steal that peace away from us, right? The enemy's going to come and try to test that theory that we have peace with that situation. You know, Gideon's going to have that peace spoken over him by the Lord. And Gideon went out and smashed an altar of Baal in his hometown. And he started to get people behind him. And Israel was starting to rally and fight, get ready to fight this battle. And then that fear, that tapped him on his shoulder once again. And Gideon didn't have peace anymore. He actually had insecurity over it all once again. So, he asked God at this time to give us some more signs, just to reassure him that this is right. Judges 6, 36 through 40. Anyone?
Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hands as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said. And that is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew in a bowl full of water. Then Gideon said to God, do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test of the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry, and let the ground be covered with dew. That night God did so. Only the fleece was dry. All the ground was covered with dew.
This is on the eve of Gideon's greatest battle that he's going to face. And now he's kind of going back and forth and wavering, right? Gideon's close to stepping into God's promise for his life. And there's that same old attack. And God's got the wrong guy for this. But God's patient and kind. And he probably just shakes his head as we lay our burdens at his feet. And then we go pick him up again, right? And then we pick him up and we struggle with him again. And then we lay him back down and we pick him back up. You know, I'm being very real with you guys because I think it's important to be transparent, right? This was probably one of the most challenging sermons I ever read. And that's because I don't have peace. I really don't right now. You know, last week we had this giant snowfall on Sunday and they didn't allow any tractor trailers on the road on Monday. They had to shut down all the roads. So everything in my work that was going to ship on Monday got pushed back a day, which should be really easy. But the problem is on Saturday, if you just shoved everything on there, your drivers still need a 34-hour reset to legally get back on the road on Monday. So if you just simply pushed everything, it'd make a different kind of mess. So I'm also trying to train my replacement through here too, so I can start my other job. We're 2 weeks into training, and then this stuff happens. And this stuff is way over his head at this point, so all I can do is just slide over, man. Let me do it and just try to follow along with what I'm doing, you know? So, you know, I felt that I see that light at the end of the tunnel, that this situation is going to come to an end. And then that tunnel, that light, that's a freight train coming at me and hitting me with something else right over my head, you know? And having that happen, you know, I'm gonna be honest, it made me angry. It made me upset, it stressed me out, it discouraged me, it frustrated me, right? You know, it put me in a bad mentality all week long. And I felt like I either had to defend myself or get beat up, or maybe sometimes a combination of both with it, you know? And I know that these are external factors, right? And they only bother me because I'm letting them bother me. But I was like Gideon in the wine press. I was focused on all the things that I can't control that was putting me in that situation. Because the root of my anger, the root of my stress, the root of my discouragement, the root of my frustration wasn't out there. It wasn't with anybody there. It's right here. It's my attitude towards it, right? I couldn't control what was happening out there, but I could control how I was choosing to deal with it. Did you ever notice that two people could be in the exact same situation and somebody is completely content and happy, but the other one is completely miserable, right? Think about a roller coaster. Somebody's having their hands up in the air, they're loving it, they think it's awesome, and the next person's next to them going, I want this to stop, right? It's your attitude, it's your approach, you know? How a dirt poor person can be so content with life and have such a fullness of it, and a rich person can be buying everything to try to fill that void and continue to just try to fill that emptiness that nothing satisfies. That's because our happiness, our sadness, our joy, our fear, our war, our peace doesn't actually have anything to do with what's out there. It has to do with what's in here. See, what happens is we don't deal with the root of our problem. You know, we don't acknowledge how we feel about it. We don't let ourselves process it to try to work through it. You know, we put our barriers up, we bury it, we pretend that it doesn't exist, but it's still there. You know, we can be afraid to deal with it internally, so instead we deflect it outwardly, and we say, oh, it's that person's problem, it's that thing's fault, it's that. But I'm willing to fully admit that my frustrations didn't stem from the chaotic situation, it stemmed from me, right? It stemmed from unresolved issues in my heart with the entire process of my transition. So it's an important thing to recognize what the root is. What's the root that's trying to steal your peace? But then when we recognize it, there's another step. We have to make a conscious decision to say that we're going to be at peace with that situation. We have to make a decision if we're going to forgive that offense against us, or that we're going to acknowledge our surrender of the situation to God because His ways are greater than ours. Acknowledge that Thy will be done, not my will be done. Or maybe we're not really at that point where we're ready to forgive or ready to surrender the situation, but we can still declare in that situation the blood of Jesus is enough to cover it. And I'm not saying that that's going to instantly make everything better, right? Or instantly make our feelings better. But when we speak peace, when we declare peace, just like Gideon building that altar, we're making a decision. Making a decision to step out of that pit. We're making a decision to not let that rule over us anymore. We're making a decision to start the healing process. We're making a decision to put it in God's hands so He can give us shalom, so He can make us whole again with it. That's where peace begins. I'm not trying to minimize our struggles or our battles, right? They can be very overwhelming. They can be very real. They can overrun us. They can overtake us. We can feel that burden's too much to bear, and we just can't. We just can't, right? We can look up to God and cry out, why is this happening? Why don't you understand what I'm going through? But when I feel moments like this, there's a scripture. And I'm going to share it because we really need to keep it close to our heart. And that's John 16:33. And it's Jesus speaking to His disciples. And He says, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So what exactly are these things that Jesus is saying at the beginning of this verse? In the Gospel of John chapter 16, there's a point where Jesus is telling His disciples that He's going to be taken away. He's telling them that He's going to be crucified. He's telling them that it's going to happen in the very near future. Jesus is telling His disciples when this happens, they're going to be scattered. They're going to leave Jesus alone. And they absolutely do when that time comes. When the Roman soldiers come up, they all scatter. Jesus tells His disciples that they're going to be sad. They're going to grieve for Him because He's not going to be with them anymore. He's going to be with His Father. But he also tells them that their grief is going to turn to joy. It's going to be short-lived. Now, that's pretty heavy stuff that Jesus is laying on. And this is probably the stuff that they don't want to believe or even think about, right? I mean, who really wants to think that somebody close to you is talking about death, right? And it's not like Jesus is on his deathbed. It's not like he's sick or anything. He's out there healing everybody, right? He's the Messiah. He's the most powerful guy that they know. You know, I would have a hard time being in the disciples' place, wrapping my head around his death if I followed him for 3 years and saw what he did. I would have thought that he was invincible. At the end of John, this chapter of John, Jesus tells his disciples this, and it's very important. He's telling his disciples, man, pay attention. In this world, you're going to have trouble. Jesus has trouble on the horizon, right? He's going to get betrayed by one of his own disciples. He's going to be taken into custody as a criminal. He's going to be put on an unfair trial in front of the religious leaders. He's going to be spit on, struck, his beard plucked, mocked with a crown of thorn placed on his head. Jesus is going to be taken to the Roman authorities. He's going to be humiliated in front of everybody. He's going to be stripped. He's going to be beaten. He's going to be scourged to satisfy a crowd. And when the crowd's given a choice to free Jesus or a murderer, the crowd is going to shout, Barabbas, Barabbas, free the murderer. And then a much darker chant's going to go up, saying, crucify him, crucify him. Jesus is going to have trouble. He's going to have a cross. He's going to have to carry that cross, the heavy wooden planks, which he's going to die on. He's going to have to carry it through the streets, carry it through the crowds, carry it through the city gates, carry it up the hill to the site of his execution. He's going to have nails driven through his hands and feet and be hoisted up for all the world to see. The soldiers are going to cast lots and gamble with his clothes, which at this point is going to be the only thing in this world that he has left. And the rest of the crowd is going to taunt and mock him and watch and wait for him to die slowly with them. When Jesus says in this world you're going to have trouble, rest assured that Jesus knows what he's talking about when he says you're going to have trouble. He knows that he knew the things that was on the horizon for him. But if he didn't experience that death, right, he couldn't have conquered the grave. Without his death, he couldn't have paid the debt for his sins. Without his death, without the cross, there was no resurrection. So yes, Jesus knew all this trouble was on the horizon, but he also knew the end result. So that's why Jesus tells us to take heart, because in times of trouble, I have overcome. You know, Jesus could have stopped this at any point, right, during his crucifixion. He had the power and the authority to do so. He didn't have to get arrested. He didn't even have to have Judas as a disciple. You know, he could have ended those trials if he wanted to. When they taunted him to come down off of that cross, he certainly could have showed him that he was the Messiah. He could have stepped off, but Jesus shows us that a Christian's walk isn't easy. And sometimes, in fact, the Christian walk is the hardest thing to do. You know, in the Garden of Gethsemane before this, Jesus prayed, Father, if you're willing, take this cup from me. In other words, if there's any other way to do this, God, please do it. Yet, not my will, but yours be done. Which I believe that is the moment where Jesus had peace with the situation. Where he put his trust in the Father. Where he knew that this was the only way. And it was the perfect way. Jesus knew what a challenge this was going to be for him. But he also knew what a challenge this was going to be for everybody that followed him too. All those that loved him. This is why in John chapter 16:33, he says, I told you these bad things are going to happen so that you can have peace. Even though they're going to grieve, they're going to have great joy. Even though they scatter, they're going to come back together and form the early church. Even though the crucifixion was a horrific act of witness, the reality is the greatest act of love in history. And Jesus is telling them that although this chaos is going to happen, don't focus on it. Focus on me. Jesus is showing them that he has peace with it. And he's telling them to look at me, because this is where you're going to find your peace. When we're in the middle of the fight, it's hard to not focus on that fight, right? It's hard not to let those external troubles dig in right underneath our skin. When the stone rolled from the tomb, I'm sure it felt like it was over at that point. But we all know that 3 days later, that stone rolled away. And it was just a countdown to Sunday, that it was coming, and everything was going to change from that point on. I want to actually end tonight with a little bit of a reflection. So, I mean, let's be honest. We all hold on to things, right? I bet that each and every one of us can say that there's something in our life that we don't have peace with. There's something in our life that we struggle with. God doesn't promise us that everything's going to be great, that everything's going to be all right, everything's going to be smooth sailing. But when we're in that wine press, when we're hiding like Gideon, letting our fears, letting our anxiety, letting our anger over that situation getting the best of us, God's standing on that edge. He's calling us out of it. He's saying, I'm here with you, my child. Don't be afraid. Shalom. Have peace over it. Don't focus on those troubles. Focus on me. And in those moments, when you do that, and it's like a hug coming over you. A hug that you didn't even know you needed. A hug when you needed it the most. So take that struggle. Take that thing that you're fighting over in your life. Just declare peace over it today. Build that altar in your heart today to Jehovah Shalom. And when that enemy comes to poke and prod and stir that pot once again, just declare that peace. Just declare that peace and lay it back down at the feet of Jesus Christ. Because he's the one